Thank you, Dom, for that nice introduction. Thank you, Dr. Ford, and the staff here for the invitation. Very excited to speak to you tonight about aeromedical research during World War II. It's a story of how scientists, specifically physiologists, learned to protect the health of the high-altitude warfighter in what turned out to be the world's first high-altitude, high-speed air war. Now, a physiologist is someone who studies the function of the body, both in health and disease. And if you're an aviation physiologist, you're interested in medical problems that are unique to flying. And so tonight, we'll be learning about a number of those. Before I get into that, though, I'd like to just kind of get us all into the mood of what aviation was like back during World War II. So we'll be talking about your body in flight in World War II. And so let's take a little walk back and listen to what aviation looked like in World War II.
Hours overdue. One of our planes was missing with all its gallant crew. The radio sets were humming. They waited for the word. Then a voice broke through the humming, and this is what they heard. Coming in on a wing and a prayer. Coming in on a wing and a prayer. Though there's one motor gone, we can still carry on. Coming in on a wing and a prayer. What a show, what a fight. Yes, we really hit our target for tonight. How we sing as we limp through the air. Look below, there's our field over there. With our full crew aboard and our trust in the Lord, we're coming in on a wing and a prayer.
Okay, now World War II was the first war in which aviation played a significant role in the outcome of the war. And so it was very important that the airmen, the pilot and the air crews were operating at optimal top peak performance conditions. But yet, even before the guns started firing or the bombs started dropping, there was an unseen enemy that I refer to as the atmosphere that they flew through. Once they were above 10,000 feet, the Earth's atmosphere becomes very deadly, dangerously deadly, in terms of the low barometric pressures, the low oxygen pressures, and the low temperatures, all of which could limit the aviator's ability to wage war. And so tonight we'll be looking at a number of the problems I've listed up here, and we'll be looking at how they developed the oxygen equipment to help maintain their consciousness and their physical performance at altitude. We'll look at the extent of the training programs where they taught men from all walks of life in different backgrounds how to understand very complicated theory about the atmosphere and the dangers of flying at high altitude. We'll look at procedures that were developed to protect the aviator, in this case exercising and breathing pure oxygen before they go to altitude to denitrogenate. I'll explain more about that later, but that prevented what was known as flyer's bends or decompression sickness. And then we'll also look at the fighter pilots and how they were able to double their productivity in the number of aircraft they shot down once they had the G suit, which would inflate and keep blood from pooling in their abdomen and their lower extremities when they were pulling very tight turns in a deadly dogfight. And they were able to outmaneuver their adversaries by wearing the G suit. We'll also look at another problem they had, which was simply escaping from their disabled plane at altitude. They were flying 250, 300 miles per hour. They were at altitudes that they'd never been at before, and they found out that they had one problem, which was having enough oxygen to sustain them on the bailout. They had to carry it with them. But another problem they hadn't anticipated was the opening shock. And there was a deceleration if they opened their chute too early, and it would rip the chutes as well as injure their back. So they had to learn how to do a safe bailout. So a good place to start our story is in 1940 with what was the prevailing view of the Allies at the time. And this is Sir Frederick Grant Banting. Some of you may recognize the name. He was the co-discoverer of insulin, for which he got the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1923. He was Canada's top physiologist, and so he was put in charge of aviation medicine for the Royal Canadian Air Force. But the statement he made prior to his untimely death was, Whichever power gets up to 40,000 feet first and stays there the longest with the heaviest guns will win the war. And he elaborated by saying the greatest problem that faces aviation medicine research today is that of high altitude flying. It is our objective to provide an efficient pilot flying at 40,000 feet in safety and comfort and with a chance of security. Now, in 1940, recognized 40,000 feet is actually a little higher than what most commercial airliners go today. Our airliners are pressurized. Their planes weren't. Okay? So they were being exposed to conditions at 40,000 feet, at 35,000 feet, actually anything above 20,000 feet that would not support life for very long. Okay? So, why fly high? Why did they want to go that high? Well, there were a number of reasons. And the first was you get above the bad weather. Okay, so you can now fly and run your mission and get to the site where hopefully the weather is better. You can also fly faster and further because the air has less resistance. Your fuel's going to go farther and you're going to fly faster. You also are going to make it harder for someone just taking off from ground level to intercept you. Okay, so it's going to be hard for that German fighter to catch you if you're flying at 35,000 feet. You also are going to be hard to be hit by ground fire. You're going to be so high up they can't see you, they can't hear you. In fact, early on, the guns could not reach them at 35,000 feet. Later, they could. And then finally, if you're on top of your opponent, you have the combat advantage. So there was a number of reasons to get up high. Now, America did not enter World War II until December of 1941. England and the UK was involved much earlier, 1939, in the fall of 1939. And the US had given Britain 20 of our first B-17 bombers. And this was the Model C bomber, and the RAF was pushing it up to its maximum altitudes, trying to get above the ground fire, trying to avoid the enemies. And they were very excited at first about having these planes, but then when they were operating them at 35,000 feet, they found out it was very tough to do. They were suffering as well as the equipment. And what they found was that when they would get up to these high altitudes on just about every flight, tactical operation at the top altitude suffered because of the reduced capability of the flight crews. And by that, they meant these guys were having problems with frostbite, having problems with lack of oxygen. They were having just a number of issues that they'd never encountered before. So America had its observers there, and one of those was John Fulton, chair of physiology at Yale. He would later go on to chair the subcommittee on decompression sickness. And he said in 1941 that the air war was a physiological war, and that was because the limiting factor was no longer the airplane. The airplane could get to high altitude quickly. It could fly great distances. What was the limiting factor, though, was the poor pilot. Plane was built for speed and stress and changes in temperature and pressure. The Aviator wasn't, so here was what the physiologists had to do. We had to learn how to protect ourselves. So now what you got to also recognize is aviation prior to World War II wasn't that high. Most of commercial aviation never went above 15,000 feet. Very rarely did they even get up to 15,000. And only a few individuals had reached these higher altitudes. And these were your adventurers, your explorers, your scientists who had gone up in balloons. For example, in 1875 there on the Tissander flight, 3 had gone up and 2 of them had died from the lack of oxygen at 28,000 feet. So it was the exception to go to high altitude, all right? A few aviators had taken the crudest equipment in terms of pressure suits and oxygen masks and gotten up to 43 and 54,000 feet. But again, that was the exception rather than the rule. So now we were asking many, many men to start flying at altitudes that we had never been in before. Much like my generation had viewed the early Mercury astronauts as these brave stratospheric and spacemen, the lay public would view many of the men in the U.S. Army Air Corps as the same type of high-altitude explorer back in World War II. So all of a sudden, we had to go from not flying up to any higher than 15,000 feet to keeping a man and actually keeping thousands of men alive at 35,000 feet. Okay, so it was no simple task. And you can look at the numbers that were involved. By 1945, the last year of the war, The 8th Air Force was flying deep into Nazi-occupied Europe, and they were sending out 1,000-plane bombing raids, okay, with 10 men per plane. Okay, 10,000 men on a single raid, and then there's about 800 fighters accompanying them. So you've got, 18,000 men up in the air who are having to breathe oxygen, not get decompression sickness, and not get frostbite. So it was not an easy task. So where did all this happen? Well, the Center for Aviation Medicine during the war was in Dayton, Ohio, at Wright Field. Today it's known as Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. But Building 29, which I show you there, and it's the little red dot over here, was where the main medical lab was. And there were a number of men, some shown here. H.G. Armstrong was an important figure. He had actually started the physiology lab at Wright Field back in the mid-30s. It would later be taken over by Randy Lovelace, shown here, and I've circled him because Randy's going to be figured throughout my talk all night long. You're going to learn a lot about Randy. Now, in addition to Wright Field, there was the aeromedical lab, there was the School of Aviation Medicine at Randolph Field in Texas, and there was the U.S. Navy Aviation Research Lab in Pensacola, Florida. Okay, the military labs worked very closely with a number of academic labs, and so the Office of Scientific Research and Development funded a number of research grants at about 22 universities across the U.S. Just to show you, the average grant was about $15,000. The largest grant was $90,000. The smallest was $1. The Mayo Clinic charged $1 to the government for doing the research on behalf of the war, and they did a lot of very important research, as you'll see, both in the development of oxygen masks as well as the G-suit. Now, one of the things that happened at Wright Field was that they had to teach these difficult concepts to men from various educational backgrounds, and they found out that if they used the thought picture method, you could see, here's my scientific guy down here, tisk tisk. This is not very scientific, but the flyer understands what he's reading if he's looking at pictures, these cartoons, okay? They help for fast remembering and fast recall. The artist was Eric Sloan. Many of you may know of him. He was a famous cloud and weather artist, also many books, covered bridges, woodworking tools. But he would do these thought pictures, and they were published in these two books, Your Body in Flight, hence the name of my talk tonight. And in case you're ever at the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., in the entryway, Eric Sloan did one of the murals that's on the wall here. You can see a jetliner flying across the southwest here. But a famous artist who really made an important contribution. So I'll be using the thought pictures throughout tonight to teach you the same thing the aviators learned back during the war. Okay, so let's start with what the main problem is. There's a decrease in barometric pressure, and as a result, the oxygen pressure drops. So if you think of air like a fluid, okay, and we live at the bottom of a sea of gas, and it's all pushing on us. As I ascend up higher into that sea of gas, there's less and less gas pushing on me. Barometric pressure drops. It's 21% oxygen at sea level, but it's 21% oxygen at 20,000 feet. There's less than half as much atmosphere at 20,000 feet than there is at sea level. So there's less than half as much oxygen, okay? There's your problem. And so what you can see here is the little pilot saying that I feel fine, I'm accustomed here, I'm at 1,000 feet. And then when he gets up to 10,000 feet, that was the mark that they used to start putting on their oxygen. If it was a night mission, they used oxygen from the ground up because it improved their night vision. All right. So here we go. Here's what happens with the oxygen. And you can see that, okay, here we're showing the white in the red blood cells is how much oxygen there is. So when you're at sea level, you're 95% saturated with oxygen. So you're doing just fine, and you've got a big smile on your face. You get up to 11,000 feet, though, and you've got a little less oxygen, 85% saturated, and you start acting now like you've had a little too many drinks, okay, a little bit tight. And now you get a little further up, and you're 80% saturated, and now you're starting to have problems concentrating. You're really not aware that you're starting to act like a goofball. And pretty soon, a little bit higher, 18,000 feet, you pass out because you have insufficient oxygen to maintain your consciousness. And you can see the cartoons were pretty accurate if we look at the actual photographs here. This is in Jacksonville, Florida, a naval aviator. You can see he's got the giggles here, and then he's starting to get a little woozy, and then he's passed out here. Revived quickly once the mask is put back on him. So a big point early on was to have enough altitude chambers to mimic low pressure conditions, to teach all the new aviators how to work their oxygen equipment and how to recognize the signs of anoxia at altitude. And so here we can see, this is at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola. What they've done here is they've told the cadets to take their mask off, and they're holding their hands out to watch to see how shaky they get and to watch their fingernails turn purple as they lose oxygen, okay? They will put their masks on before they pass out. They'll do writing, and they'll see their writing get very poor, motor skills get very bad. So this was something they had to do. Not so much that they could recognize it in themselves because you're not aware, but you could recognize it in your mate that's flying with you and know that he's got a problem with ice in his mask or something's come loose or something, bottles that run out. And so this was very important. It also happened in the U.S. Army Air Force. This is at Wright Field, Santa Ana, Mitchell Field in New York, Cochran Field in Georgia. And it happened all over during the first 2 years of the war. There was this explosion in the number of training areas. By 1945, we had over 200 aviation physiologists whose sole job it was to train these guys how to use their oxygen equipment. We had 65 altitude indoctrination chambers at 45 Army airfields. And this is incredible. We were indoctrinating nearly 60,000 men a month on how to protect themselves in an unpressurized plane against the problems of decompression sickness, anoxia. So it was a huge training program that went on. In addition, you needed to have the teachers and the flight surgeons. A flight surgeon is a physician who, in addition to doing regular doctoring, is also trained to understand the medical problems of high altitude flight. And you can see that just about the time that Pearl Harbor was going on, the size of the typical flight surgeon class is shown here. And if we jump ahead from 1941 to 1943, you can see that it increased dramatically. And this would happen several times over the course of each year. And these men were being assigned to the bases here in the States, as well as the active war zones assigned to each bomber group and fighter group to help them be in the best medical health they could be during their operations. Not only were there flight surgeons, but there were also men who were trained solely to take care of the oxygen equipment. That's how important it was. These were men who knew how to take care of the masks, how to take care of the regulators, the valving, and keeping it all operational. It was so important for the missions. There were also the men who were trained as aviation physiologists who ran the altitude chambers. And I was blessed enough to meet Francis Chenard. Francis actually called me up a few years ago and said, you want to meet me? And he said, I ran the 41st Altitude Unit in High Wycombe, England, which was where the 8th Air Force was based. And what he would do, he was a physician, but he would help. In fact, this is his wife. She was a British lady he met. She worked in the factories putting the fluorescents onto the dials that went into the RAF's planes. They met at a cafe, and it's been true love ever since. And what Francis did was he got a mobile altitude chamber from the Royal Air Force, and he hooked it up to a diesel truck, and he would drive around to the various American air bases there were in England. And he would make sure that they understood how to use their oxygen equipment. Well, some of these guys were kind of macho and didn't think that they needed to use their oxygen mask. So what he would do in those cases is he would start playing poker with them. And he'd wear his oxygen mask, okay? And they'd zip up to 20,000 feet, and he'd clean them out. And then he'd bring them back, and they would realize that, well, I guess I better wear this mask from now on. So, and he giggled when he told me that story, too. So that's Okay, so we should talk a bit about where did the oxygen equipment come from, because we did not have it when World War II started in 1939. What we had was pretty much a holdover from the old days. You can see this guy had this little pipe stem that he would stick in his mouth, and as early as 1935, that's what we were still using. You'd stick it between your teeth and kind of smoke your oxygen when you're at altitude. What would happen is in 1938, and you would get the first successful oxygen mask, and it was called the BLB mask for Boothby, Lovelace, and Bullion, and those were the three men who invented it. They were all at Mayo Clinic. They were researchers and physicians there, and you could see it covered just the nose, so you had to make sure you didn't breathe through your mouth because you'd still suck in oxygen and still pass out, okay? But it was the BLB mask, and they teamed up with, I believe it was Northwest Airlines. This is what this picture is showing. And they made coast-to-coast news when they flew at 20,000 feet from Minneapolis to Los Angeles. Never been done before. Okay, 20,000 feet, that's half as high as we fly now. Big deal. They made several stops along the way. They were mobbed by the press. And here they are. Lovelace was the one who did most of the heavy lifting on this project. He's shown right there. This is where they touched down at one of their sites. This is Lovelace doing blood gas analysis during the flight to make sure their oxygen levels are normal. And as a result of Boothby and Lovelace, and then working with Harry Armstrong back at Wright Field, in 1939 they were awarded the Collier's Trophy from FDR because it was the first year in commercial airline history there had never been an accident due to pilot fatigue and hypoxia, anoxia. So this was a big deal, and they were recognized for the advances that they'd made to increasing safety in aviation. Now, he also used this mask to push himself up to 40,000 feet, as shown here at the Mayo Clinic chamber, and they made the first ascent up to 40,000 feet in an altitude chamber using the BLB mask. Now, they realized that they really had to close it off, so they came up with an oral nasal mask, and just as a side story, Prime Minister Winston Churchill hated the thing. You can see what he called it. It was a damnable muzzle. He actually preferred the BLB mask because he was able to smoke his cigars. And I didn't have a picture of him, but you can envision what it might have looked like here with this guy. Not sure it's a good idea, smoking and oxygen, but, you know. Okay, so the mask would evolve from this continuous flow mask that wasted a lot of oxygen to a demand mask that would only allow oxygen in when you inhaled, inspired. So you had to take less oxygen on a mission, less weight. Eventually, though, they would make this mask here. It was a pressure breathing mask. And what this is like it's a little hyperbaric chamber strapped to your face, okay? The pressure of oxygen that sustains us is determined by the percent of oxygen times the barometric pressure you're at. If you go to 100% oxygen, that's as high as you can go, right? Once you get up to about 35,000 feet, 100% oxygen isn't enough. Barometric pressure is so low that the oxygen pressure doesn't get high enough to sustain you, okay? So they said, well, let's increase the pressure in the mask and give them 100% oxygen. And doing that, they could get up to, instead of 35,000 feet, up as high as 41 and 43 and 47,000 feet. This would become very important later on for the reconnaissance pilots who did not have guns. Yet they could get above what the enemy could in terms of altitude to evade them if they were attacked. Okay, this is an interesting picture. This was testing the prototype of the pressure breathing mask. And this was a big deal. They went to nearly 43,000 feet in a B-17, unpressurized. These are the two Boeing test pilots here, and here's Randy Lovelace. This is what the prototype looked like. And this was highly significant because they landed and they said, you know, with this new pressure breathing equipment, it makes it possible for the first time to extend the current engineering test program of the B-17 Flying Fortress well up into the 40 to 50,000 foot range of altitudes without awaiting the development of pressure cabins. Okay, so they were looking still early in the war, November 42, that they might have to go to 40 and 50,000 feet in an unpressurized plane, which is, I mean, that's unheard of, okay? It would turn out that they would not need to do it. Actually, the highest a B-17 would go is about 44,000 feet. But they, at the time, this was what they were excited about. And this was such a significant event. Anybody in here knows what a short snorter is? No, okay, they're like a challenge coin. Back in World War II, if you made a significant flight, you would pull out $1 and you'd sign your name on it and what the conditions of the flight were, and you'd pass it around, everybody would sign it. And then you would make sure you carry that, because if your colleague ever asked to see your short snorter and you couldn't produce it, you'd have to buy him a short snort, okay? So this is Randy Lovelace's 40,000 foot snorter. And on here, it's hard to see, but here's Reed, who's the pilot here. Down here is Jim Frazier. And then this is kind of like a who's who of Boeing and Lockheed aircraft companies. They had a post-flight debriefing figuring out how they could get their P-38s and their B-17s up to 40,000 feet. Two of these guys, Lovelace and Joe Toll, a Lockheed test pilot, just about 6 months later, they would get up to just under 45,000 feet in a Lockheed Lightning, which some of you might say, well, that's just a one-seater plane, right? Well, they flew piggyback. They took the radio out, put a plywood seat in it, and these are two other fellows from Lockheed here, but Lovelace hunched up in the back, and using the pressure breathing equipment, they were able to get up to just shy of 45,000 feet, which, again, as I said, shortly after this, they were able to start doing this with the reconnaissance planes, the same aircraft. This was the certificate that Lockheed gave him. I love this. This is the Order of Piggybackers. Of course, here's your piggyback. And here's Randy Lovelace hugging Joe Toll. And I love the bird here. You see the bird, the feathers flying off? Yeah. Yeah. So this was a significant flight because this was an altitude record for the U.S. during the war, and it remained classified until after the war had ended. Okay, so you're at 35,000 feet. You got low pressure. Gases in your body are expanding to 5 times the normal size. So if you ate beans and cucumbers, you're in trouble, okay? You're also got not much oxygen, but on top of that, it is stinking cold out there. And so if you were in the European theater of operations in 1945, you were flying on average to around 25,000 feet in your bomber, and you might go as high as 30,000 feet, and you'd do this about 35 times. And it could last for many hours. You'd be at maximum altitude for a good 6 to 8 hours of that time. Okay? How cold was it? Well, it was colder in Europe than it was Pacific. It was still cold in the Pacific, but in Europe, in January at 23 to 30,000 feet, you can see it was minus 36 to minus 60 degrees. Okay? And then it would warm up in July to minus 13 to minus 39. They talk about having to urinate and having it freeze before it hits the fuselage. Okay? Take your gloves off to try to unjam your gun, and your fingers would stick to it. So it was terrible cold. They all talk about how bad the cold was. Frostbite was a major problem. You can see when the 8th Air Force first arrived in Europe, there was like 90% cases of it on the missions. And they were able to finally get it under control, but it would still spike again the next winter. So it was a serious problem. This is just showing you ice formation in a demand oxygen mask. You know, you're exhaling your warm breath. It's saturated with water vapor from your lungs. And you do that, and you can see you start to plug up your mask. Okay, and so you got to sit there and break it up, break the ice, or else it's going to plug your oxygen supply while you're shooting a gun. Okay, so that's why I said this was the unseen enemy. The atmosphere they were in was just terrible, and they don't portray this in the movies. You know, but it was. You read books about it, and it was a very real part of their story. Now, don't worry. I show this because this is page 1 of about a 14-page report on aborted missions in the 8th Air Force due to cold and hypoxia. And so we're going to enlarge some of these right here. And what it's showing you is that, okay, here on January 27th, 91 planes went out. A third of them returned because of problems with the oxygen holes and the ball turret was broken. So where was that? Well, that's this little guy down here on the bottom. Aircraft returned early. Look at 83 went out. All of them returned in February because of oxygen regulators froze at the tail gun, which is this guy here. Waist gunner had problems here. They also wore these electrically heated flying suits. And if those failed, if a wire got kinked and broke, the suit didn't work. And I'm told that when they did work, it wasn't that you were warm, it was that you were less cold, okay? So if the suit didn't work and if the oxygen didn't work, you couldn't do your missions, okay? So winning the air war was very much dependent on being able to perform with adequate oxygen and at least not freezing. Another problem with low barometric pressure was the fact that nitrogen in your body would come out of solution. And so divers, we'd known for many, many years, would form nitrogen bubbles if they come up too fast. Well, the same thing happened when you started flying very fast up to altitude. and you would get air embolism, they called it. And so that was first discovered with altitude chambers by Harry Armstrong. He observed bubbles forming in goats. And when he analyzed those bubbles, it was mostly nitrogen. And nitrogen is a gas that we're all filled with, but we don't consume it. Okay, it's inert. So if we pack it into our bodies at sea level and then fly up to a low pressure, it's going to form bubbles. It's going to cause blood flow to stop. It's going to cause paralysis. It can even cause death. But they figured out that, well, let's get rid of the nitrogen. How can I do that? Well, if I breathe 100% oxygen, that's 0% nitrogen. And if I do that while I'm exercising, in this case, walking on a treadmill or throwing a baseball or doing jumping jacks, they would do a variety of things. They found that they could get the nitrogen out of their bodies and ascend up to very high altitudes and not get the air embolism, the decompression sickness. Okay, so the oxygen pre-breathe became very important. They first flight tested it. A Lockheed pilot, Milo Burcham, pre-breathed and exercised, kept breathing oxygen, and he flew up to, 35,000 feet, and the P-38 Lightning had no problems with decompression sickness. So this became very common practice before flying on a mission. And again, there's Milo on the short snorter. This is just showing you how effective it was. If this is the time breathing pure oxygen before you ascend, and this is the decreased risk or the amount of protection you had against decompression sickness. So it became a very important treatment for preventing the bends. In fact, it was so important that the aeromedical lab at Wright Field would name their research plane the nemesis of air embolism. And so let's look at that.
The name of a plane is a curious thing.
Note the dog. We'll talk about him in a little bit.
Those endearments, painted with such sincereness on planes. Those glorious nicknames that held great meaning for its crew, its spirit, its fame. Rips order, conjugate, victim operator, no sweat, better duck, bottoms up. The nemesis of aeromedical. Oh, the name of a plane is a curious thing. A curious thing is a name of a plane. Oh, the name of a plane is a curious thing indeed.
Okay. So they thought, well, how can we prevent all these problems? And they thought, well, what about a pressurized flying suit? What if I take ground level conditions and put it in a suit that I wear? Then I don't have to worry about the cold, the low oxygen, or the gas expansion in my body. And you can see what some of the early pressure suits looked like in the magazines that were preceding the war and early on during the war. And they would actually build one and try it, but the main problem with it, which has always been a problem, is that they're very stiff. And this is a fellow trying to bend over the mock-up of a bomb site. You can see he's not doing too well. So they did not develop the pressure suit during the war. That would come after the war. So they said, how about pressurizing the aircraft cabin? And so the first mass-produced pressurized plane would be the B-29 Superfortress. Shown here, it would be deployed in the spring of 1944. It was essentially, you can see here a little pressure chamber and a pressure chamber here. The tunnel went over the bomb bay. It was pressurized. Its diameter was determined by the fattest engineer they had at Boeing at the time. And this was a big deal because look at, you can now fly above 30,000 feet without oxygen masks, okay? Everything was great. However, what happens if you lose pressure at altitude? Remember when they say, in the unlikely event of loss of cabin pressure, it's very likely when you're having people shoot at you. So the question was, well, what happens if I rapidly decompress? I'm at about 6.5 psi here, and all of a sudden that air is going to come shooting out. There was a number of questions they had. Would I survive? What was the pressure I should have in the plane relative to the altitude I was at? Would there be mechanical damage to gas-filled organs like the lung and the stomach? Was there injury from the wind blasts as the plane essentially emptied like a big gas cylinder? Would I have time to put on my oxygen mask before I passed out from anoxia? And would there be a higher incidence of decompression sickness? You know, would more nitrogen form? Would you bubble like a shaken soda? And so the first thing they wondered about was time of useful consciousness. And so at Wright Field, they took this little metal sarcophagus, they called it, and stuck it inside the big altitude chamber. And this would be your pressure cabin. And they would set this at like 25,000, or excuse me, at about 10,000 feet inside here, and then evacuate the main chamber to higher and higher altitudes. And then they would blow the end off so the guy would decompress. He'd crawl out, and they'd start a watch to see how long before he passed out. And so you can see that at 25,000 feet, you've got just over a minute. And as you go higher, you've got less time. And at 40,000 feet, you've got 14 seconds. This is why they tell you at 38,000 feet, put on your mask first before you start helping those with you. Okay, the other thing they don't tell you is that they're going to put the plane in the steep dive and go to lower altitude where barometric pressure is higher, because you remember 100% oxygen won't sustain you above 35,000 feet. Okay. So then they upgraded from the metal sarcophagus to the, they took the pressure suit that they tried to develop and they put a paper diaphragm in the back, and the suit became the pressure cabin. And so he was pressurized in his suit in the altitude chamber, and then his buddy would come up and jab a screwdriver into his back, pop that, and he'd rapidly decompress. And then they'd take chest x-rays before and after, and he said he survived. You know, they didn't know if he was, but he would, and His internal gases increased by threefold. There was a slight to moderate gas pain localized in the epigastrum, but in all cases it subsided in 3 to 4 minutes. So he survived. The next step was they wanted to come up with pressure differentials and rates of decompression. And they figured if you decompressed quickly, a big pressure differential wasn't a good thing because gases would expand and cause tissue trauma. If there was a slower decompression, you could probably withstand a greater pressure differential. So they began varying this orifice on this panel here and pressurizing this cockpit while they evacuated the air around them. They would pop that and measure the relationship between the rate of decompression and what happened to the man inside. What they found out is shown here, which the real take-home message is, if you decompress quickly, like in a fighter jet, and the canopy blows off and boom, you're decompressed, you can only withstand about a 2-fold increase in gas expansion before you start having tissue trauma. If you're in a big bomber or a commercial airliner, you can use a higher pressure differential because it'll decompress slower, so you can withstand a 4-fold increase in gases before you're hurt. And so based on that, they came up with, for very heavy bombers, they would use 6.5 psi, and for fighters, they would use a little less than 3 pounds per square inch. Okay? As far as I know, these are pretty close to the guidelines they use today. Okay, so while Wright Field was figuring out the requirements for pressurized flight, down the road in Columbus, they were trying to figure out what happens physiologically to the pilot who undergoes rapid decompression. So they got a chamber in, and this chamber had 2 chambers to it. It had the pressurized aircraft cabin and the big atmosphere next to it. And so what they would do is put a membrane in here and have this be anywhere from 0 to 20,000 feet, and this be 50,000 feet. And watch what happens. It blows out, the air expands, and a cloud forms because a fog is forming as water comes out of, condenses. Okay, on the other side of this, you're going to see what happens now. All this air is going to empty from here to this side, and you'll see if you put some papers there. Okay, so you can envision that if this hole's bigger and you're standing right there, that might be you going through it, right? Stay tuned. Okay, so they had the Lab of Aviation Physiology at Ohio State shown here. They started with animal studies, and what they found was as the pressure dropped around you, and you see the fog forming, the pressure drops so much that your lungs empty. You can see the breath coming out of the rabbit here, and the gases inside the body expand with the drop pressure around him. So this is before and then during, and you can see the difference here. Okay, gas expansion. That expansion of gas would inhibit venous return to the heart and cause a transient drop in blood pressure, and would push fluid up into the head and cause a pressure spike that would cause small lesions. Did not kill the animals, but they would survive. Okay, so this is just to show you what it looks like in humans now. We're going to just take you to 38,000 feet from about 20,000 feet. And this is a long study. I'm just going to show you the act of rapid decompression. You're going to see the men here, and watch their chests that come shooting out at you. I'll repeat this about 4 times. Can you see that? So that's when the pressure is quickly dropping around them. And what's happening is there's less pressure pushing on them now, and their chests actually expand out to a larger volume. This was part of a study to see who would get the bends. Was it greater with rapid decompression? And what they found was that no, it wasn't. If you were moving around and exercising, that masked any difference that might occur with a slow decompression versus a fast decompression. These guys were mostly moving around, working guns, moving ammo. You weren't at any greater risk if you rapidly decompress. But they worried about the wind blast. And here you could see the B-29 had a scanning blister. These things would blow out. And it was not uncommon for guys to go shooting out when that would happen. Here you can see a guy dangling from his harness right here. And so this is what could happen. And they began to wonder, well, what do we do with commercial airliners in the post-war period? Knowing that this happens, how big do we make the windows with 6.5 psi? Okay. You'll notice the window's a lot bigger than what you have today in your commercial airliners. There's a reason. There's also a reason they tell you to wear your seatbelt when you're flying, okay? Incidentally, this dummy's name was Oscar. I guess he's still on display at the FAA. Okay, so 2 more topics, we'll be done. High altitude bailout. And so the 2 problems there were having enough oxygen to sustain you and the parachute opening shock at high altitude. You can see there the rip in the parachute riser. Randy Lovelace, once again, would make his first parachute jump from 40,200 feet. And it would be his first jump. It would set an altitude record. Here they are denitrogenating before they go up in the nemesis of aeromedical, which you can see here. And here he is, and you can see he's pre-breathing oxygen. Here's his bailout oxygen. And here he is getting ready to jump through the bomb bay, which he commented it was a hell of a long way down when you looked. And off he went. And they quickly started circling around him. They thought he was dead after he jumped. They saw no sign of life. He was just dangling limp. And incidentally, the chute was on a static line, so it opened right away. Later on, they would determine that he had been hit with 33 Gs of deceleration. He had knocked both gloves off of his left hand, I believe it was. He would get frostbite. They'd give him the Distinguished Flying Cross, and then he'd say, we better study this and figure out how to do a safe parachute jump from high altitude. So they back at right field, they teamed up with the Mayo Aeromedical Unit. And remember the dog? I just pointed out the St. Bernard. Well, they had 145-pound hard rubber dummies and 200-pound ones, but they wanted to make sure the dummy data could be extrapolated to a living animal. So they went to the Dayton Dog Pound, spent $3, and they got Major, the St. Bernard. And they fattened him up to 145 pounds and made him an oxygen mask and a flight suit, and you'll see what happens. So how they measured opening shock is shown here. This is the Lindquist-Ryan tensiometer. This would be the start of what would eventually evolve to the black box data recorder that's now used on all planes. This fellow here would develop that as well as the retractable seatbelt. The way this worked was there was a clock wound mechanism that would send a strip of film across, and there were a series of coils that would compress when the parachute opened. And it would pull on a stylus that would scratch across the film moving on it. This was calibrated in pounds of force. And so you would get a trace up here that gave you time in the G-force that was developing on the parachute. And so they looked at different altitudes, shown here, different speeds. They would take the parachute dummy. Here you can see here's his neck opening. Here's a shoulder. Here's the tensiometer. Here's his parachute. They'd line 6 of them up on the bomb racks, drop them, get the clocks going, and here you go. You'd see it dropping. The greatest shock would occur just about where the red arrow is. And here's 6 of your chutes coming down at altitude. And what they found out was, okay, here we are, half a second, 25 Gs of deceleration when you open your chute at 25 atmospheres, or 25,000 feet. And what they found was that if you opened your chute at lower and lower altitudes, the opening shock became less and less. So here we're going from 40,000 feet and 33 Gs to 7 and 3,000 feet to much less, a third of that. Okay, so they came up with the whole concept of a delayed parachute opening. What happens is as you leave the plane, you're traveling the speed of the plane, and you actually slow down to a terminal velocity that's slower. So the force is less. So they taught them to bail out and wait a long time before they open their chutes, and they would not be injured from the opening shock. Just a bit about Major. You can see him here. They're trying to convince him that, yes, he does want to jump again. So here he goes. And he would make multiple jumps. And one of the things I wondered about was, well, actually, I was able to talk to Ken Penrod's son. He said, Dad talked about this a lot. And he said that the dog would dog paddle all the way down. He needed to be moving. He also said that he got less and less enthusiastic about the mission the more times they dropped him. So they had to convince him. And so I'd always wondered, I knew they went up to 33,000 and 40,000 feet, but the dog didn't jump at those altitudes, even though they made him a flight suit to keep him warm. And I wondered why. Well, when I got the color slides from the Lindquist family of these adventures, written on the slide was Major, after 26,000 drop, harness ripped. So they almost dumped him out of his parachute at 26,000 feet. And so I'm sure they figured, well, we'll forget the 33 and 40. We want to keep the dog intact. So that's why Major never went to higher altitudes. He retired, but he would be a national hero, being reported coast to coast in newspapers as well as Canada. It says here, Major, willing subject of Army experiments at Muroc Air Base. I'm not so sure, but there he goes. Okay, last topic, acceleration and G-forces. These planes were very high performance. They could dive and almost reach the speed of sound. The problem there is as you pull centrifugal force here, it gets harder and harder for the heart to pump the blood up to your head. You begin to starve your eyes and your brain of oxygen, and you begin to gray out, lose your peripheral vision. Eventually you lose your vision altogether, and eventually you pass out. This was studied many places, Australia, Canada, the US, using centrifuges. They would also come up with a straining maneuver, the M maneuver, where they would grunt and keep blood from pooling in their legs. This you can see is Earl Wood at 4 Gs, and here he is at 8 Gs, still doing fine, even though he doesn't look it. He's grunting away. And what would come out of all this work is the G suit. This was a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot in New Guinea. It would start, though, very crudely with first wrapping the bodies. That didn't work. And then over the course of the next 2 years, they came up with a number of bladders that would inflate, squeeze the legs, and keep the blood from going into the limbs. If you were in Rochester, Minnesota, at the Mayo Clinic, and you would look up in the sky during 1944, you would see a dauntless dive bomber called the Gee Whiz flying around. Right down here is the Mayo Clinic. And they made over 700 dives testing the G-suits and the lack of the G-suits. And so if we look at this here, you can see the Gee Whiz pulling a sharp turn, pulling very high G-forces. In the back is the physiologist. He's wearing an oximeter on his ears to measure saturation of the blood with oxygen. He's got a black cap on to keep it was light sensitive. He doesn't have the G-suit on, he does. And here he is. You can see as he starts to fly, starts to pull G's here. You see he starts to pass out. You see blood's desaturating, the heart's starting to not beat. In blood, the pulse is not reaching the ear. It takes him a while before he comes to, okay? And with this, wearing the G-suit, they could increase the number of G's that they could tolerate. They could outmaneuver their adversary. And as a direct result, they doubled their productivity in air combat, where they shot down 16 planes per 33 10,000 operational hours. They doubled that with the G-suit. So it was so important that when Willie Messerschmitt saw one on a downed American pilot, he said Germany had nothing like this, and we knew we'd lost the war without such equipment. So was it a 40,000-foot war? Well, it was not as a rule. Most of the battles occurred at 20,000 and 35,000 feet, but yet we over-prepared. We developed the equipment such that when the jet age started, we had the oxygen equipment. We had the G-suits. So it was a good thing. Interesting quote here. There was a general belief that if air power had been equal between Axis and Allies, the differences made in the Army Air Force aeromedical research would have provided the margin of supremacy. So that's how important it was. Men like Randy Lovelace would go on to play a big role in the space program. He was a major decider who was our Mercury astronauts. He would later go on to be named head of manned space flight medicine. And last slide. Then and now, you can see things haven't really changed. The pressure breathing masks are based on the same principles as are the G-suits. This is pre-breathing oxygen. Now we do it before we go up in a high altitude reconnaissance flight or spacewalk. Here's the Red Bull jumper. Much of what he had learned started with Randy Lovelace's jump from the stratosphere, and explosive decompression is still a threat. So thank you for your time. Sorry to go over, but if you want to hear more about this, there is a podcast, and you can find it, Lifelines, Episode 8, April of 2008. Thank you. Yeah. Questions? Yes.
Oxygen. Oh, thank you. Oxygen is a gas just like nitrogen is. Why is there no such thing as oxygen embolism?
Good question. Any gas will make bubbles. And so oxygen is, if you analyze some of that, you saw some of it was oxygen. But we consume oxygen. Our tissues eat it, if you will. Okay, so it gets reduced in our bodies, whereas nitrogen isn't consumed by anything in our body. So in the fact that it's 80% of the air we breathe, that's why it's the major contributing factor to the bubbles. So when you did the denitrogenation, you removed the main source of the bubbles. You still got some, but you didn't get enough to give you the bends. Yeah.
I saw that some of the pressure suits were Goodrich pressure suits, and I worked for Goodrich back in the early 60s. I remember reference to someone named Wiley Post, who was one of the early pressure suit pioneers, but I don't remember the dates and exactly what was going on there. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so Wiley Post had, there's a great picture, I've got it somewhere on my computer. It looked like a deep sea diving suit. It had a big helmet on his head. And they actually tested it at Wright Field in the altitude chamber. Harry Armstrong, the fellow I referred to several times, who started the physiology lab, he worked with Wiley Post, testing it initially in the altitude chamber before Post would fly up at like 30-something thousand feet in the Winnie Mae. That was mid-30s, I believe, 35, 36, somewhere in there.
It appears that the chambers that we're looking at resemble the hyperbaric chamber. A hyperbaric chamber, though, they put pressure in it on those, they withdraw it.
Yeah.
Is that where the hyperbaric chamber was developed at that time?
No, hyperbaric chambers actually existed. You can go back into France into the 1800s. Excuse me, a fellow named Paul Bert, B-E-R-T. He was the one that figured out the relationship between barometric pressure and fractional concentration of the gas gave you partial pressure. He had both. He had hyperbaric chambers and hypobaric chambers, altitude chambers. No, the hyperbaric chambers existed about the same time the altitude chambers did. In fact, hyperbaric pressure probably existed before hypobaric because of the caissons. When they were building the bridges and they were digging the caissons down to bedrock, they would pressurize those, and then the workers would come up and they'd keel over with decompression sickness, and they didn't know what was wrong. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Can I ask a question? I wondered, were any women ever involved in any of these?
Yes, women were involved. Fred Hitchcock, it's actually how I got into all this. I discovered his stuff when I was a student at Ohio State. It was in a closet, the movies and stuff I showed you. In his explosive decompression studies, he also studied women, and he looked at the incidence of decompression sickness following rapid decompression. Women were studied at Wright Field because they had the women pilots that were ferrying the bombers. And there's a great book called A Wasp Among Eagles. It's a good read. You can do it in like 2 days. And I can't remember what her last name was, but she was the first female test pilot at Wright Field, first woman to fly a jet. And if you read that book, you'll get real good insight as to what it was like being a woman. She flew on the nemesis of air embolism with a special flight suit because they had to come up with a way for her to be able to relieve herself at altitude because they were using these women to ferry the planes back and forth. And, yeah.
And let's thank our speaker.